capitalist societies, materialist societies. They do need to fill that void in their hearts because capitalism and materialism would not bring about any inner peace, would not bring about happiness, would not really reconcile your heart and mind, and will cause you all of the distress that we see around us and sort of the anguish that capitalism and materialism causes to human beings. But the interest in Sufism in particular, and Islamic Sufism in particular, is also fueled by big players that may not be particularly visible to us. It is not a secret that the Rand Corporation in 2002 advised that there should be a strategic alliance between basically Western governments and Sufi movements. And this has been the advice of Bernard Lewis all the time, and people like Daniel Pipes and so on and so forth. They all find this to be particularly relevant, particularly important, because they believe that Sufism will make Muslims a little bit calmer, and that will be more conducive to peace between East and West. And keep in mind that as Muslim minorities in the West, no one is interested in peace between the East and the West. Just naturally more interested, has more, stake in this than the Muslim minorities in the West. So it is not that we are not interested. It is just that maybe we have a little different definition of peace, or we may have different thoughts about how peace can prevail between East and West. A peace that is just, a peace that is based on basically the recognition of people's right to self-determination, independence, and basically dignity. But we are more interested, the Muslim minorities in the West would naturally be more interested in peace between East and West than Daniel Pipes and Bernard Lewis. We're keener on seeing that happen and take place. And we may have better action plans to see that come to fruition if we were to be consulted. It is not only that this interest is fueled by this. This interest is also fueled by authoritarian regimes in different parts of the world that may find in Sufism, or that may find that Sufism may bring about more basically stability, or the stability of the status quo in the Muslim world, quietism, quietness, calmness, stability, and so on and so forth. So there is an interest in that as well. So why are we basically playing in their hands? Why are we talking about Sufism and trying to reclaim the Sufi discourse? Exactly to do the opposite. Because Sufism, in its pure, it depends on which iteration of Sufism we're talking about here, because there could be different iterations of Sufism, different version of Sufism. The Sufism, the pure Sufism, people like Ma'ruf al-Karthi and Saray al-Saqati and Abu Sulaiman al-Darani and Sahl al-Tustari and Ibrahim al-Khawas and Abu Sa'id al-Kharraz and Muhammad al-Kattani and the Sayyid Junaid. Of course, I should have said it. And all of this. This type of Sufism has nothing to do with pacifism, antinomianism, which is lawlessness, or pacifism, or any of that, any of these concepts. Let us then figure out where did it come from? Where did that term come from? And where did the concept come from? If the term was not coined by the Prophet ﷺ, and we know that it was not coined by the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, where did it come from? It came from you know, the tabi'in or tabi'at tabi'in, probably third generation, you know, started to become known during the third Muslim generation. People like Abu Hashim al-Kufi and others that felt the need to emphasize certain concepts, certain values, certain Islamic values, they felt are being sort of endangered by the prosperity enjoyed by the majority of Muslims during those times. You know, the Islamic civilization was up and coming. There was so much prosperity. By the middle of the Umayyad dynasty, end of Umayyad dynasty, beginning of the Abbasid dynasty, all the way until the middle of the Abbasid dynasty or Khilafah al-Abbasiyya by the year 350. That's the end of the earlier part of the Khilafah al-Abbasiyya, the strong phase of Khilafah al-Abbasiyya. Muslims enjoyed a lot, you know, were very prosperous. And people have felt, some of the righteous predecessors have felt that people became so indulgent in the life of this world, that people started, during the time of the companions, Ridwanullahi alayhim, there was complete harmony and consistency between rituals and spirituality, between the interior and the exterior, between, you know, practice and beliefs, everything, there was consistency, there was harmony. And that's why the Ummah prospered, and that is why the Ummah had this much strength and this much vitality and this much prosperity. But then later, there was like a gap, a rift, a gulf being formed between the interior and the exterior, between the law, you know, and morality. And some of the righteous brothers felt that even some of the scholars and some of the fuqaha are too hyper-technical. They are too basically focused on technicalities of the law. They became too legalistic, and they are ignoring the important values, you know, of asceticism, for instance, zuhd, for instance, the important values of a'mal al-qulub, you know, the actions of the heart, the inner state, and so on and so on and so forth. So to basically emphasize the importance of those values, this is basically the core of Islam. This is what Islam is about. إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ, except one who comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with a heart that is sound. So if this is the core of Islam and this is what Islam is about, we are seeing this departure from the core of Islamic teachings, and we're seeing that the people have become overindulgent. Let us remind them, let's bring them back. That's basically how it all started. And those people were called initially as zuhad, and then somehow, and the root of this word, you know, etymologically speaking, it is very difficult to figure out where it is coming from. Ahl al-Suffa, from Suf, wool, or Ahl al-Suffa, or what is it, or Safa, purity. You know, people have different theories about the root word, or basically Sophia, which is al-Hikmah in Greek. So people have different ideas and different theories about where it came from, but it is not it's not important for us. It just, some people started to become known as Sufis, or started to become identified as Sufis. The early ones, it was basically about an emphasis, a focus, calling the people to come back to the realities of the deen, and to come back to have a focus on their inner states and the actions of the heart and so on, and not to be focused on the exterior only. Still, the exterior has an importance, but not to be focused on the exterior only, but also give the due attention to the interior as well. But then over time, things started to become a little bit different. You know, so far everything is great, right? So far everything seems to be completely consistent with the core values of Islam. So how is it then that we have in our history basically that much division between the scholars over Sufism, that much disagreement between the scholars and the mujtahids of this deen over Sufism, between praise and dispraise, and statements from the greatest of the scholars, Imam al-Shafi'i. How come someone like Imam al-Shafi'i would say that, no one would become a Sufi at the beginning of the day except that he will become a fool by dhuhr, by the time of dhuhr. And this was reported, this is established from Imam al-Shafi'i. How come something this pure and this good becomes so controversial among us Muslims? It is not at all about that which is pure and good. There is some room for people to disagree over certain practices. Some would consider it okay, some would not consider it okay. Imam al-Shafi'i, for instance, al-Inshad, which is basically religious songs. Imam al-Shafi'i says that this is something that, blasphemous people invented in Baghdad to divert the people away from the Quran. Some other people may think that religious songs have some values, that they may be okay. In moderation, may be fine. Taghbir basically would be religious songs. And so there is some room here for controversy, some room for controversy, but most of the time, the controversy was not about the same thing. The controversy was about different iterations of Sufism, different versions of Sufism that are practiced by different people. So if you are exposed to people who have a Sharia non-compliant iteration of Sufism, you develop that idea about Sufis and the path of Tasawwuf and so on and so forth. And if you are exposed to people who have a Sharia compliant iteration of Sufism, practice a Sharia compliant iteration of Sufism, then you will be fine with it. So the scholars who praised and dispraised Sufism, they were not talking about the same thing. Like I said, we have to agree that sometimes there is some room for controversy. So sometimes scholars would praise and dispraise the same thing based on their judgment of its wholesomeness or its legality from an Islamic perspective. But most of the time, it was not about the same thing. It was about different practices, that they may see prevalent among the practitioners of this of Tasawwuf, and that is why their judgments would differ. But then, over time also, and this was early on, Imam Shafi'i was talking about this early on, but over time also, what happened to Tasawwuf, what happened to the pure Tasawwuf of the Sufi masters that I've talked to you about is that they started to incorporate some philosophies that are foreign to Islam, some philosophies that may have origins in different cultures, Greek or Indian cultures, Hindu cultures, etc. And they started to incorporate them. They started to, basically mystify Sufism. It's basically started to become captured by the philosophical discourse and to make Sufism very philosophical. And when it became philosophical, it became very mystic. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praised the Sharia, praised the Quran by being Kitab Mubin, a clear book, and praised the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam by being Rasul Mubin, a clear messenger. That mystification caused a lot of harm, because when things become mystified and and when you put a lot of emphasis on linguistic finesse versus the core meanings, the core, clear, simple, straightforward meanings of this religion, then you lose a lot. You lose the meanings, and you become captured by the language, terminology, about sort of the rhetoric. The rhetoric takes you away from the meanings, that we're talking about. And then, so we started to talk about things like, and that is an effect of the theory of emanation, and it goes back to Aristotelian logic, and it goes back to Aristotle's, the undifferentiated and undifferentiating God, the unmoved mover who does not change, and how could there be change in the universe? So they thought that we have emanated from God, and there are different layers. Philo inserted different layers, Plotinus, and so on. It's Neoplatonic philosophy. So emanated from God, if we emanated for God, then we can go back and merge with God. We can have a union with God, but that's the opposite direction, okay? And then we started to talk about union, and the earlier masters of the past had a completely different iteration of that union. They meant by union your togetherness with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They meant by annihilation basically the subservience of your will to the divine will, to the point where your will does not exist anymore. You will not accept that which He wills. So that is annihilation of your will, fana al-iradat, annihilation of your will. You becomes completely, and certainly like we said in the morning, it's not an ontological annihilation. It does not mean that there is a merger of wills here, but it means that your will have become so subservient to Allah's will, as the Prophet ﷺ said, حتى يكون هواه تبعا لما جئت به لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يكون هواه تبعا لما جئت به. None of you will have belief until his hawa, his desires are consistent or in conformity with that which I have brought forth. So they had, and then they were talking also about some form of fana al-shuhud, that your beholding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make you so focused, attentive to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you can never be distracted by all else, as-siwa. And that, to some extent, we do agree with this, right? Like, the people will be like glass boards in front of your eyes. You see through them. You see the work of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whenever the harm or benefit comes to you through the people, you are seeing through them that this is the work of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you try to respond with that in mind, that this is a test. Whatever it is a test, a different form of test. الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا. He who created life and death to test you. So everything is a test. So whenever something does something to you, you see the work of Allah and you see that you're being tested. That is your shuhud of Allah, your beholding of Allah, and that is why they say tasawwuf is all about ihsan, because it is that shuhud of Allah. And ta'bud Allah ka'annaka tarah, to worship Allah as if you see Him, and if you don't, then you know that He does. So, but then we started to talk about the ontological fana, and the ontological fana will be very problematic, because it means that there is no difference between worshipping idols and worshipping God, because the idols are God. It leads you to pantheism and monism and wahdat al-wujud and al-ittihad, al-hulul, and all of these heretical beliefs. So now so many things have become confusing and problematic. Now you have a heritage that is full of jewels and gems and pearls mixed with rocks and scorpions and snakes. And what do you do? So people had, and not only this, because we had also, as Imam Taymiyyah rahimahullah says, that there are three different types of Sufis. There is Sufiyat al-Haqa'iq, the real Sufis. They are about the realities. They are about the meanings. They are the pure ones who are after purification of the heart. They are after the meanings. They are not after, monetary gains, and they're not after celebrity or fame or recognition. Sufiyat al-Haqa'iq. And then Sufiyat al-Arzaq. Sufiyat al-Arzaq, basically the Sufiyat that are after monetary gains. There were endowments set up for them to live in them and to basically to receive sustenance through those endowments. So we had so many of them throughout the Muslim world. And even Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah was not particularly opposed to it, but he said there are certain conditions that they need to meet to be deserving of the sustenance. But he said that these are not Sufiyat al-Haqa'iq. Sufiyat al-Haqa'iq are usually not living in those motels or in those places that are set up for Sufiyat al-Arzaq or the Sufiyat that are after monetary gains. But he said that those Sufiyat al-Arzaq, even some of them could be good and so on, but they are not the best. And then he said there is Sufiyat al-Rusum or Sufiyat al-Rasm, the Sufiya ceremonial Sufis. Sufiya about basically formalities that would wear a certain attire. And he said that just as much as there are ceremonial mujahid and ceremonial scholars, people that wear the attire of scholars, like this, uh, and people who would wear the attire of the mujahids to look like they are something that which they are not. There are also people who try to wear the attire of the Sufis to look like they are when they are not. So it became institutionalized. It became institutionalized. And with institutionalization, different word, institutionalization, you know, a slew of problems would arise because it became certain paths and there you have to follow your sheikh. And then we started to hear about things like you have to surrender to your sheikh like a dead body surrenders to the washer. And that was not really, you cannot find this in the statements of the earlier Sufis. And keep in mind here, we're not making, when we say early and late, does not mean that all late Sufis were wrong or bad. Absolutely not. That would be unfair. And it does not mean that we did not have some seeds of problems in early Sufism, because we try to make those dichotomies all the time and they don't make sense. Like all of a sudden at one point, Sufis have switched from being the best of the best, you know, to deviant people. And that's not true. Of the latter Sufis, there are good people. And in the Sufi discourse, where were the seeds? Where did they come from? The earlier masters, Mashayikh Ahl al-Istiqama, the upright Mashayikh, the Mashayikh of Istiqama, the upright Mashayikh, they wanted to say to the people, knowledge alone is inadequate. Knowledge alone is inadequate. They wanted to emphasize the inadequacy of knowledge. Knowledge without sort of the experiential practice, without, you know, walking the talk, without like reforming your interior. Knowledge that is not transformative, that does not change you, is inadequate. Is that right? It should be right. And, you know, and people who have good exteriors and they don't have good interiors, that is hypocrisy. So they wanted to say that. Then, in order for them to say that, some of them will overdo it a little bit, resulting in what? Undermining the importance of knowledge over time, undermining the importance of knowledge, and undermining the epistemic value of the scriptures. In favor of what? In favor of the ilham, the inspiration, and the zawq, the taste of the mashayikh, and al-mukashafat, the spiritual disclosures of the mashayikh. These are valid concepts. There is something called ilham. There is something called zawq. They have a complementary role in the epistemological theory of Islam. They supplement. They help you have a better understanding. They assist you to have a better understanding of the scriptures. They don't have an alternative role. They are not alternatives. They do not supersede and they are not alternatives of the scriptures, but they complement. But these values were abused by some later. And we started to create a rift between al-haqiqa and sharia. Sharia is the knowledge of the scriptures that is learned, you know, through transmission, transmitted knowledge of the scriptures. And al-haqiqa would be the realities that are captured by the heart from the divine. And now when you create a dichotomy and you divorce al-haqiqa from al-sharia, you can realize how devastating that is to the value of the scriptures, to the value of the knowledge of the scriptures. And then when you do this, what happens? When you favor the taste and ilham of the mashayikh, then the mashayikh become the authority, not the Quran and the Sunnah. Did the earlier and the verifying Sufi masters of the latter generations approve of this? No. Did it become a problem? It did become a problem. But the verifying of the latter mashayikh, just like the early mashayikh, never meant that, never wanted that, except if someone was hypocritical. Because you could have a faqih who's hypocritical. You could also have a Sufi who's hypocritical. So but people people who value the Quran and the Sunnah, people who value the Wahy, people who value this deen, would never want to undermine the epistemic value of the Wahy. Okay, so this was one seed that we had there. Then another issue was mysticism. With mysticism, you know, the favoring linguistic finesse over clarity, linguistic finesse, aphorisms over clarity. And we know that our deen was all about clarity. It was so transparent, straightforward, solid philosophically. Keep in mind there are three different levels of discourse: rhetorical, dialectical, and philosophical. Our deen is solid philosophically, but rhetorically accessible to everyone. The language is accessible to everyone. Everyone can understand it. Everyone can see the beauty of it, can see the strength of the argument, strength of the beliefs, accessible to the peasants, accessible to the philosophers. Everyone can. But then when we mystified it, and I'm not against basically changing the discourse to suit the audience. We do need sometimes to change the discourse to suit the audience, but at the same time, the change of discourse should not go back to affect the core meanings and core concepts, which should be clear and should be accessible to everyone, and there should be epistemic egalitarianism in the sense that, you know, there is no exclusivity here. Our beliefs are accessible to all people in a very egalitarian way. Yes, the discourse may be different. The language may be different. If you sit with a group of philosophers at Yale University, for instance, to talk to them about certain Islamic concepts, it is understandable that you may use different rhetoric versus sitting with a group of, you know, whatever, people that may not have the same level of education. So it is understandable. But then this went back and affected, because of the aphorisms and because of the unclarity, it went back and created room for what? Different interpretations. Because of the masters, you know, they speak in a way that is brief and that may basically be interpreted in different ways. They create room for people to interpret those statements in different ways. And that was a problem that would basically manifest later, where the early masters, the great masters, the Sharia-compliant masters, would be misinterpreted by the latter generations. Another problem that we have is like this syncretism, basically mixing things up, you know, bringing things, you know, basically the tendency to be open to other philosophies and even other theistic traditions. And when you undermine the epistemic value of the revelation, you create room for people to favor certain philosophies based on their taste and based on their inspiration, their feelings. They create to accept certain philosophies. Then we started to have these philosophies about union and about annihilation and about, you know, union and so on and so forth. And these became so prevalent later on. So what do we do? How do we reclaim the Sufi discourse? And why is it important? Why is it important? I believe it is important, not because we do not want it to be hijacked, because at the end of the day, what matters most to us is what? Our own survival, our relationship with Allah. The pleasure of Allah is what matters the most to us. Because aversion to that discourse will hurt us. Aversion to, you know, the heritage of Al-Junayd and Al-Karhi and Saqati and will hurt us. Therefore, it is important for our own spiritual well-being. It is important for our spiritual well-being, and it is important for our deen and for the generations to come that we reclaim it so that it does not become hijacked. If you have aversion to it, it can be basically hijacked, and the hijackers will take uncontested ownership of the legacy of Ibrahim ibn Adham, of Abu Hashim al-Kufi, of al-Karhi and al-Saqati and al-Tustari and al-Khawas and al-Kharraz and everybody. Can we afford that? No, we can't. We really can't. We cannot afford this. We cannot afford to have this aversion to it. We need to reclaim it for our own benefit and for the benefit of our deen, and so that we have a Sunni interpretation for tasawwuf, and that Sunni interpretation of tasawwuf will prevail. Believe me, al-haq alayhi nur. You know, al-haq has, you know, is covered with light. And if we basically regulate the discourse by the Quran and the Sunnah, inshallah, it will prevail. What do we need to do to, you know, to regulate the discourse according to the Quran and the Sunnah? I think that we have to have emphasis on the scriptures, you know, the Quran and the Sunnah. And it is in the heritage of the Sufi masters, you know, that emphasis on the scriptures is part of the heritage of Sufi masters. Al-Junayd said, this affair of ours cannot be engaged by someone who does not know the Quran and the Sunnah. Everyone, Abu Sulaiman al-Darani said, you know, some of the lata'if and isharat, some of the symbolism of the people, I come across the symbolism of the people or the isharat of the people, the gestures of the people, and I would not accept any of them except with two witnesses. Who are they? The two witnesses that have to witness to this, you know, aphorism, to this statement, Quran and the Sunnah. That's what Abu Sulaiman al-Darani said. And these are the greatest of the masters. So that emphasis is important. The emphasis on the first community as a role model, where we have seen all of this, where we have seen the tawakkul ala Allah, the tawakkul ala Allah that they had, and the belief in the aqdar, not make them pacifist, not make them antinomian, lawless. They still had reverence for the commands of Allah. They still had basically proper understanding of human agency, human accountability, human responsibility, with complete tawakkul and reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But sometimes, without being exposed to the, you know, to a tasawwuf, people become too confident in their agency. They don't have enough reliance. So that reliance tempers their sort of haste. That tawakkul ala Allah, that, you know, that trust in the divine decrees, and understanding that our human agency is also has limitations, it has a lot of limitations. So the Sahaba had the perfect balance, where they had complete tawakkul ala Allah, but they still resisted al-aqdar by al-aqdar. They resisted the decrees by the decrees. And they were still, you know, فرسان الرهبان الليل فرسان النهار, monks at night, nights during the day. So you will not find a better example of pure tasawwuf than the tasawwuf of Abu Bakr and Umar radiallahu anhuma. You know, let alone the Prophet ﷺ, that's a given. But you will not find a more proper tasawwuf than the tasawwuf of Abu Darda and Abu Dharr radiallahu anhuma. So that emphasis should be also extremely important on the, you know, the first community. And then emphasis on clarity versus mysticism. Clarity versus mysticism. You see, sometimes people like the glittery, fanciful, linguistic finesse. And many times we sort of feel, you know, people in the academy, they know that. You know, you feel sort of impressed by sort of difficult terms that you have to look up in the dictionary and stuff like this. Whereas when they asked al-Junaid, for instance, about the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they asked al-Junaid about the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Can you say it? Said it this morning. No, but we should all memorize this. They asked al-Junaid about the love of Allah, and this was like a gathering of the mashayikh that would be Junaid's friends, you know. And everybody started to say what they thought of who is a lover of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is the muhib. And Junaid said, عبد ذاهب عن نفسه متصل بذكر ربه قائم بأداء حقوقه قد أحرقت قلبه أنوار هيبته وصفى شربه من كأس وده وانكشف له الجبار من أستار غيبه فإذا تكلم فبالله وإذا نطق فعن الله وإذا تحرك فبأمر الله وإذا سكن فمع الله فهو بالله ولله ومع الله. I will translate this, but anyone who speaks Arabic here understood each and every word. No complexity whatsoever. Nothing mystical about it. But the friends of al-Junaid, the greatest of their time, they told them, you know, nothing can come up with anything more beautiful, better than this, more comprehensive than this. So he said, you know, the person who is in love with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a person who's detached from himself. He's able to walk away from his ego. And that is a huge benefit of immersion in the Sufi discourse. Because there is huge emphasis on walking away from your ego, being able to detach yourself from your ego. Because no matter what, all of the disputation between us, all of the arguments between us, any discussion that happens between us, everything is being filtered through our egos. And that makes it very difficult for us to have reconciliation, for two business partners to come to terms, you know, over a dispute, for two spouses to come to terms over a dispute. Everything, it's called, Kant calls it the synthetic role of self-consciousness. Your self-consciousness synthesizes your reality. Your reality is different from my reality. We're talking, because I am standing behind my ego, you are standing behind your ego, and my ego is filtering what you're saying, your arguments, and vice versa. So it's a huge benefit. You know, this immersion in the Sufi discourses, that's one of its biggest benefits, is to be able, because the emphasis, keep in mind, إنما العلم بالتعلم وإنما الحلم بالتحلم, as the Prophet ﷺ said. You know, ilm is by learning, and being forbearing is by practice. So when you repeat it, and one day you will get to, you know, act on it. One day you will get to realize its importance and try to do it one time. So try to do it one time. Like I use this example always. When like your spouse yells at you in the morning, try to say to yourself, it's the first test of the day. Don't say to yourself, oh, she's back or he's back. No, just say to yourself, it's the first test of the day. And look at the scene from outside as a third party. Walk away from your ego. Anyway, but this is important. So when you are connected to your abdun zahibun an nafsi, a servant who's detached from himself, because you can't, as Abu Yazid al-Bastami said, when he said, I asked the Lord, how do I come to you? He said to me, walk away from your ego. And I stripped myself from my ego like a snake would strip itself from its skin. So walk away from your ego. And then when you do this, مُتَّصِلٌ بِذِكْرِ رَبِّهِ, who is connected to his Lord through his remembrance. But all of this is not someone who is, you know, basically intoxicated or anything. قَائِمٌ بِأَدَاءِ حُقُوقِهِ, you know, which means always fulfilling his rights, the rights of his Lord. So he's not someone who's like saying, I don't need to do this anymore. سقطت التكاليف is not someone who is inconsiderate of the deen or the sharia. قائم بأداء حقوقه, always fulfilling his rights. قد أحرقت قلبه أنوار هيبته. So the lights of the divine majesty burnt up his heart. وصفى شربه من كأس وده, and he subsists on the nectar of his compassion, of the divine compassion. He subsists on the nectar of divine compassion. So you see the love and the fear together in harmony, in unison. So then he says, وَانْكَشَفَ لَهُ الْجَبَّارُ مِنْ أَسْتَارِ غَيْبِهِ, and Al-Jabbar, the irresistible, had manifested himself to him from behind the veils of the unseen. So if he talks by Allah, and if he speaks about or from Allah, and when he moves, it is by the command of Allah, and when he is still, he is with Allah. فَهُوَ بِاللَّهِ وَلِلَّهِ وَمَعَ اللَّهِ. So he is by Allah, for Allah, with Allah. No mysticism, perfection without mysticism. Perfection without complexity. And that is how the early masters used to be like. So that is the third one that we talked about. So the first one was scriptures, second one is the first community, the third one is clarity. That's the third principle. The last principle is دع ما يريبك إلى ما لا يريبك. Leave out that which causes you doubt to that which does not cause you doubt. When you go through a book and you're not comfortable or you're not sure with parts of it, leave them until you are sure that they come to you from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because there is no gate to Allah except the gate that was opened by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam for us. There is no road to Allah except the road that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam walked on before us. You know, his footsteps are on that road. Follow them and you will get to your destination. And that is basically what I wanted to share with you about reclaiming the Sunni, this Sufi discourse. The Manazil al-Sa'irin is a very beautiful book, and if you're interested in it, Madarij al-Salikin is going to come out. Dr. Uwaimer Anjum, who goes, like, his name here is Ovamir Anjum, I guess. But Dr. Uwaimer Anjum, I think, is about to finish his translation of Madarij al-Salikin. And Madarij al-Salikin is a marvelous book. If you put Qaradawi, Sufism, in Google, you will find Sheikh Qaradawi's sort of assessment of Sufism. And somewhere in the last paragraph, he talks about Madarij al-Salikin, that this was because it is easy, very easy to dismiss the Sufi heritage, like many fuqaha did. And it is very easy also to accept it uncritically, like many people did, including some of the fuqaha. But what Ibn al-Qayyim did is, he did the very, very hard work of embracing it and lovingly and critically filtering that heritage, lovingly and critically examining it to basically provide an iteration of it that is Sharia compliant. And that's what Sheikh al-Qaradawi says in that very nice assessment, very fair, very nice assessment of the history of Tasawwuf. So you probably want to read that, inshallah. قولوا قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك اشهد ان لا اله الا انت استغفرك واتوب اليك.
Inshallah, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to pray 2 rak'ahs. So formulate your questions for the Sheikh, because we're going to have some extended time for a Q&A with the Sheikh. So if you need to refresh your wudu, if you need to use the restrooms, please do so. We're going to start again at 9:20. The 2 rak'ahs will be prayed at 9:20, inshallah, in about 10 minutes. Jazakumullah khairan.
least in the eyes of some people, a bad name. And I'm going to share with you a message that was posted by a priest friend of mine on Facebook. I think you might find it interesting, and I'd be curious to know your reaction to it. In the meantime, here's the phone number. We can get to the phone calls right away. The number is 888-914-9149, 888-914-9149. Let's start off with Victor, listening in Downey, California. Hi, Victor. Welcome.
Hey, Father Patrick, how's it going?
I am doing well. I am a father, biologically, but I am not a priest.
I'm in front of the church right now. I'm sorry. I've been married for 12 years. My wife of 12 years is now